Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for this conversation on the future of urban farming in Chicago. My name is Shannon Morrissey, and I'm the preceptor for the Chicago Studies program here at the University of Chicago. Today's event is part of a series of virtual discussions we're convening on the topic of Chicago futures. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, many are wondering, what does the future of cities and city life look like? So in addition to scholarly presentations and imaginings of the future of US cities, we wanted to talk with professionals in some of the industries that have been most impacted by the pandemic. Of course, that includes all of those connected to the food industry, and we wanted to focus this week on the farm workers, growers, and producers whose work during the pandemic has been essential to getting produce to stores, restaurants, and to markets. I'm happy to be joined today by Sydney Coyle, a grad student at DePaul University studying sustainable urban development with a focus on food and environmental justice. Sydney is working in partnership with the Chicago Food Policy Action Council to map Chicago's foodshed to connect local farmers to Chicago's markets. And in case you're like me and didn't understand just how large a foodshed can be, we're talking about a 300-mile radius that encompasses 7 or 8 states across the Midwest. Sydney puts her research into practice at the Gary Comer Youth Center, so I'm excited to hear more about that work and how Sydney helps others in the education garden, cultivating produce for the Grand Crossing community. Sydney, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
To get started, I'm hoping you can just share a little bit about how you got involved with urban farming in Chicago.
Yeah, definitely. Kind of throughout my whole life, I grew up in a really rural area in New Hampshire and have kind of been minorly connected to farming, working at a farm-to-table restaurant, going to my local farm in my hometown throughout the time that I was growing up, but very much took that for granted and just kind of thought that's how it was. And then I moved to Chicago and got really interested in environmental justice work. And kind of through that, really just discovered the importance of food and how those two things are interconnected. And then very recently, in my graduate program, started doing research work on food justice, particularly, like you said, mapping that 300-mile radius food shed, and becoming a lot more interested in how this is happening on the ground. I was doing a lot of theorizing, talking to a lot of farmers, but really needed to have that experience to like back up my research of what's happening at the farm today. What are the problems that we're facing right now? And all of this is happening in COVID when there's a dramatic shift in what farming really looks like in the city and all over the world. And yeah, that's how I got started.
I definitely want to get into some of the COVID specific questions, but first tell me a little more about the master's program, what you're learning and what made you want to apply and what you hope to do after.
Yeah, so in my undergraduate degree, I studied environmental science and peace, justice, and conflict studies, and was really interested in how those two kind of collide, like how movement work and activism and social justice are related to the environment. And the sustainable urban development track at DePaul, their grad program, really does an incredible job of highlighting how those two things intersect in a really tangible way. So we're looking at the infrastructure of our city and how food systems are working, how pollution from heavy industry on the south side is affecting how people can grow food, affecting people's health, and how that's related to food. And so really just got involved in kind of getting some more tangible skills, doing a lot of data analysis, GIS mapping, and using that to hopefully better the food system that we have.
Through your own work or through the program, have you come across any sort of misconceptions people have about farming. I mean, you mentioned being from a rural area in New Hampshire. What is with this distinction between urban farming and other types? Yeah, what would you have to say about that?
I think there's quite a few misconceptions. A big one is that it has to be really large scale. Another is that I think a go-to perception of a farmer is a white man in overalls, and that is not the case, especially in urban areas, but all across the country and the world. Farmers are diverse, and it's really important, I think, to highlight that farming looks different and should look different in different areas, in the same areas, because we're all growing for different reasons. We're all growing to meet different needs. And while we're all feeding everyone, there's different cultural needs in food that a large monocrop farm is maybe not going to meet the needs for. So things like that, I think, are really important to keep in mind, that farming is far beyond just the food you pull out of the ground. It's about community as well.
Are there questions that you have or you still have about food or farming?
So many. I'm currently in a beekeeping class and just like learning new things about bees every day, and they're fascinating. And just every vegetable, every fruit needs something different. And I think there's just endless knowledge out in the world about how to grow different things and what that means for the soil and the water. But also, I think like a huge part of where my interests lie are how does food impact communities, and really looking into the wider scale, more social issues interconnected with food.
I think that's a good segue into some of your own work. I've got a couple more questions we can hit at the end, but I'd love to hear more about your research sort of mapping the food shed, and I'll mute myself and let you go ahead and share the screen.
Yeah, definitely. All right. All right, can everyone see the screen? Okay, perfect. Okay, so the research project that I'm currently working on is in support of the Good Food Purchasing Policy and Initiative, which is a national program. It was first adopted by LA and has kind of since been spread all across the country. And essentially, it is a program and policy that holds public institutions to a higher standard of food purchasing. So there's 5 core values, and that's local economies, nutrition, a valued workforce, environmental sustainability, and animal welfare. And essentially the program is like a LEED certification. So like you can get your building with a stamp of approval or an organic certification on your produce. The Good Food Purchasing Policy is kind of an incentive for institutions to focus more on where and why they're buying from certain people. And I go to DePaul, so Chartwell's is that big institution for me and our dining hall and for a lot of dining halls across the city. But also Chicago Public Schools, the Park District, are all part of this. So a lot of people and a lot of food that gets eaten by Chicagoans is impacted by this. And what the purchasing policy is attempting to do is, when CPS or Chartwells are sourcing strawberries from Mexico or from California, the Good Food Purchasing Policy says, hey, wait, there's a local farm in Illinois that can meet that need for you and that you should support. Or you could get your blueberries in Michigan. You don't have to get them from so far away. And that all goes to really focus on supporting local food. And I think that's been huge in the pandemic as well. All of a sudden you see all these food flying off of the shelves in supermarkets, and we have that food here. But no one's looking locally to source it. And so that's kind of what this is all about. And so the city of Chicago adopted this in 2017, and then Cook County as a whole adopted it in 2018, and they incorporated a racial equity lens, which is kind of where our work is focusing on really bolstering that for Cook County and holding them accountable to that. So I do my work through DePaul, but in partnership with Chicago Food Policy Action Council. And they are an incredible group of people who are really working on that equity lens, acknowledging the history and current structural racism in Chicago that impacts our food systems, and acknowledging that there's trauma tied to food, particularly for Black and Brown communities, and growing food, and really looking at how people of color have shaped our food systems from the inception of this country. And so CIFPAC really works with a super diverse group of farmers and local advocates and researchers to make these policies work and make them work for them on the ground in communities and at farms that are trying to thrive and are thriving and doing really incredible things in the city and across the Midwest. So I kind of like to start with these working definitions of food equity. I think we've all heard the terms like food access and food insecurity, and food deserts. And a lot of those things really work from a deficit lens and don't necessarily acknowledge the intentionality behind the racism that's in our food systems, and the intentional neglect that our government and different policies have really imposed on communities. So a relatively new term that's popping up in food justice work is food apartheid. And Dara Cooper describes that as systemic destruction of Black self-determination to control one's food, hypersaturation of destructive foods and predatory marketing, blatantly discriminatory corporate controlled food system, and how that impacts health in communities of color. And then moving on to food justice, which is what all these activists are fighting for, which is equity and fairness in relation to food. However, very recently, a lot of communities have said that's not enough and have coined the term food sovereignty, which is an alternative movement where people have ownership over their food systems. And that's part of what we're trying to do with our research is how do we create spaces and opportunities where people of color own their food systems. They're in control of where their food is coming from. And everyone, but a hyper focus there. So the work that I'm doing specifically in this is working to map all of the farms in a 300-mile radius of Chicago that are producing specialty crop food. So that's food for human consumption. I think it's important, we'll look at the maps later, but I think it's important to acknowledge that 75% of all of the land in Illinois alone is farmland, and 75% of that, more than 75% of that, is going to create animal feed. So it's not even going directly for human consumption. And there's, not saying everyone should eat what they can and what works for their bodies, but there's argument that's wasteful, and there's a lot more people we could be feeding if we weren't feeding animals. But basically what we're doing is focusing on connecting all of these farmers to Chicago's market, and creating a resource for these institutional buyers like CPS to connect with local farms. So they have a database when they're looking to source cantaloupe and they don't know where to go and they want to go to California or somewhere far away. They can check here first and find all of the local farms in this 300-mile radius that are producing that could provide that for their institutions. And in this work, we're prioritizing the identification and connection of BIPOC farmers to that market, with the acknowledgement that the USDA and the US government and other institutions have created a lot of racial trauma surrounding land and food and the identification of Black farmers and taking their land, and Indigenous farmers and taking their land. So not all BIPOC farmers want to be identified, and for good reasons. There's a distrust there that's very valid. And so we're trying to do this in a way that honors that experience, but still provides a resource that if they want to, they could be connected to places that give them a space to sell their food. So this is, my coworker Alyssa made these. This is just USDA data, so it's incomplete. But this is just kind of a look of what the radius looks like. So it's all of Illinois, Indiana, most of Michigan, Wisconsin, and then parts of Iowa, a little bit of Minnesota, Kentucky, Ohio, and Missouri. And so these maps kind of show where BIPOC producers are located in higher concentrations. And then you can kind of parse that out by, if you're looking at people who identify as women who are BIPOC producers, you can get a clear kind of screenshot of who's where, and where are we focusing our research on. Then these are just kind of later iterations of this, with some hotspot analyses of where these farmers are located. So as you can see, Michigan is a pretty big hotspot, and it's kind of always like Detroit is the urban farming place to be, particularly with Black farmers really leading the way there. So essentially what I'm hoping to do with my cohort is turn all of these county lines into pinpoints of addresses of where farms are located. So everything that says there's 30 farms in this census tract or zip code will turn into 30 dots on the map. And there's upwards of 3,000, 4,000 farms per state we're looking at right now. So it's a lot of dots. And then the next kind of portion of this study that Wesleyan Ashton at Illinois Tech is working more predominantly on is doing a feasibility study for a BIPOC-led food hub. So that is a place where you can actively aggregate, distribute, market, and hold food as kind of that middleman. So a lot of farmers express issues with being able to distribute their produce and having to go through packaging places and distributing firms. And a lot of those, even if you're a small farmer, are really large organizations that aren't necessarily accessible for everyone. And there's a lot of racism that exists in those spaces as well. So she's doing a feasibility study there, studying food hubs across the country, and then analyzing Chicago's market for a Black-led food hub, and then also conducting a lot of surveys and interviews with farmers from the data that we've collected of all of the farms in the 300-mile radius. Just learning about if they want to be connected to institutional buyers, if they prefer to support the communities that they're in and they don't want to expand, but trying to gauge the need and who wants to be connected. And here's a little food hub graphic that's more direct than a regular food system looks. So here's just a few food hubs that are existing in Chicago currently. Gourmet Gorilla, Black Oaks, they're all doing really incredible work. And since the start of the pandemic, there has also been a lot of places popping up that are acting like food hubs that aren't necessarily a food hub in essence or as they started. So places like Green City Market, Urban Growers Collective have really kind of evolved and changed their models to provide a space for storing and aggregating and distributing. And just some other initiatives that I'm currently involved in and working on, or that SIFPAC is working on as well, is the Midwest Consortium on Equity, Research, and Food Justice, which is a mouthful. We call it MSERF. But that is a space where farmers and researchers and people from all across the Midwest can come together to kind of talk about the work that they're doing and collaborate. We're also doing work, Howard Rosing at DePaul and Danny Block at Chicago State are doing work to map cold storage in the city. So there's a pretty big lack of that right now. And we're trying to identify, like, where is there an old supermarket that has refrigerators that people can store food in? Because that's a big barrier to distributing a lot of food. And then this picture is Chicago Urban Agriculture Mapping Project, which I helped to kind of populate. It's a self-propelled map, so farmers or owners of urban gardens can enter their own farms, and it's a resource for community gardens. If you're looking for a space to get involved or a space to buy food, it serves as a resource for that. So I definitely recommend checking that out. And yeah, that's what we're working on.
Sydney, it's awesome. And it was great to see the visual of the food shed in the mid. I mean, it's wild to think that, I mean, of course, when we're buying produce from grocery stores and what have you, I mean, it's a much larger network of connections globally for where we get our food. I have a couple follow-up questions, a couple things that kind of made me think of other programs or other things Chicago Studies has been involved in because of your presentation. One of which is there was a student podcast with Hidden Gems with the founder of Impossible Foods, who created like the Impossible Burger. I know this is kind of a contentious, debated thing, but what are your thoughts about sort of the future of not meat-like but non-meat products? And is that something that you've studied or you've thought about in your program?
Yeah, I think, again, it's an issue of accessibility. And those, even if you're getting it at Burger King, it's like $11 for a burger as opposed to a regular beef burger. And that has to do with government subsidies on beef. But I hesitate to like encourage people to go vegan or eat less meat, because I think, yes, that's a part of it. Like individual decisions are a huge part of it, but I think that the larger issue at hand is how institutionally we're operating our food systems. I think, yeah, sustainably, climate change wise, like we're going to have to reduce food or meat consumption in general. But I think everyone has different dietary needs. Everyone has different access to foods. So if you can, do what you can. But some people need to consume meat, and some people don't. And that just has to do with individual bodies. So I like to say like a bigger, beyond your personal decisions, like lobbying, getting involved in local government, in federal government, wherever you find your place, but really advocating for more just food systems is going to make an additional impact there than what you just do kind of personally on your own.
That's awesome. It was fun to see the kind of organizations that have become food hubs during the pandemic. Are there other ways in which you've seen, farmers, producers, or organizations involved in food change because of COVID-19?
Yeah, a couple months ago, I went to an Illinois Stewardship Alliance conference where we were kind of talking about just that, like how has COVID impacted farmers? And this is from all over the state. So you've got urban growers and rural growers, which is super interconnected. There's always kind of like an urban-rural rivalry, but we rely on each other. And kind of depending on where these farms are located, a lot of farmers are saying it's impossible for them to provide wages for workers to gather their produce or take care of their animals. And some farmers, particularly those who source to farmers markets, were saying, like with mask mandates and social distancing, like we're the only ones who can touch the food. So it takes a lot longer for one person to go through our line at the farmers market. Because we have to give them more attention and like hand pick all of their produce for them and really give them this more personalized experience. But it also slows down how fast they can get their food off of their tables and shelves. So that's a big kind of more negative impact that people are having to overcome and face. And thankfully, I think that's kind of lifting a little bit. But on the flip side, you see organizations who have just reimagined what their farms look like and how they're operating, even with reduced staff on site and not being able to have volunteers. A ton of urban farms rely on volunteer work. And that's really restricted right now. And Urban Growers Collective has been like incredible during the pandemic. And even like I work at Gary Comer, and from March last year to now, even with very limited staff, like for a few months there, they had no one on the farm and they had to kind of start from scratch in the middle of the growing season. And they were still able to provide 10,000 pounds of produce to the community in the last year. And you just see people like really appreciating and communing around food because that's the necessity, and that's where we can help each other right now.
I'd love to hear more about your work with the education program at Gary Comer, and also for people who aren't familiar, what does the Gary Comer education complex involve? Like, what are all the programs there?
Yeah. So Gary Comer is a youth center that's attached to a high school in Grand Crossing. And they've got a ton of programs from dance to art and writing, and also a really incredible program called Green Teens, where youth from the community learn about the environment and they help out on the farm. And that's been kind of paused this year, but I work with the crew leaders and farm managers at the farm who've been able to stay at the farm all year. And we have just been working on growing and kind of starting like a new way of growing in pandemic life, and hopefully we'll get the Green Teens back this year. But Gary Comer does just like a ton of incredible work. This past few days we've had our Earth Day celebration called Spring Forward, where all of the youth are like presenting on Green Teens and all the things they learned, and it's been really incredible to see the work that they are doing.
Another thing I was wondering, just because we talked about sort of common misconceptions of farming, I think another assumption people have is that locally sourced, sort of sustainably, organically grown produce is always much more expensive. Do you find that's the case? And what might you recommend for students on a budget who are, trying to become more conscientious consumers?
Yeah. Unfortunately, sometimes that is the case. Just because it's harder for smaller farms to get funding, and they don't get the same subsidies that Monsanto or Tyson would get. Um, but I think, especially particularly in the community that I work in, and also like Englewood, like Growing Home in Englewood run programs where for people in the community, you're getting produce at a lower rate. So Growing Home does like, I think, half market rate in their community, but then they sell at market rate in Lincoln Park at Green City Market. So there's really innovative ways that urban farmers who are local to the city are making food accessible. Um, and also, like, a fun way, if anyone's interested, is getting your own community garden plot or volunteering. A lot of times when you're volunteering at an urban farm, you just end up getting produce to take home. So there's fun workarounds around it, but I would say that try going to farmers markets like across the city. And more often than not, you can find something that's cheaper than what you would buy at Whole Foods or Jewel. I guarantee it, there's something there.
That's great. Another sort of close to home farm that I'm thinking about is Sweetwater Foundation. I'm not sure if you're familiar. Emmanuel Pratt taught a course as a visiting scholar at UChicago called Rerooting, Cultivating the Ecology of Place. And something that he talked about is often sort of the metrics for success in all kinds of farming, and particularly urban farming, involve things like crop yield and waste and things that just don't make sense within their sort of ecological model, in which, crops that stay on the ground and rot are just replenishing the soil. So it's interesting. I think the farms close to home, and even like the plots like you're describing that you may be able to have in your own backyard, that can be a great source as well. I know the students who took the course were like sent home with kale and whatever they could just pick and find. So that's great.
Definitely. There's a lot of just like innovative ways to, I mean, we talk about like circular economies a lot. Like the plant in Chicago is like the famous example of that, of like, how can you make this work in a less expensive way, a less pollutive way. And yeah, exactly, like stuff like that, like keeping plants in the ground when you don't have to get rid of them and they'll just decompose and refertilize the soil, crop rotations, things like that are incredible ways to reduce the amount of fertilizer you need to buy and things like that. But yeah.
Are there any questions from folks listening in? I just want to take a second to invite you all to drop questions in the chat, or if you're comfortable, feel free to unmute yourselves and we'll go to your questions.
I had a question. I was curious, what food hubs or markets is Gary Comer like involved with? Where can we buy Gary Comer produce?
Good question. In a couple weeks, we'll be having a farmers market pop up on site, which is really exciting. Kind of like the first time we've been able to do that since pandemic happenings. But Gary Comer is really focused on keeping the food in the community. So I think about 80% of the food that we grow is either going directly to the youth center or to pantries in the neighborhood, or to the farmers market that's in the neighborhood. And about 20% of what we grow goes to local restaurants. So you can come on down and visit to get the produce, but we're not necessarily out at like the big farmers markets. Yeah.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about what the education program that's been built around the garden space at Gary Comer looks like. Where where do you find yourselves focusing kind of the heart of your educational efforts? And more broadly, maybe what are some of the food education gaps that you see in your work? I have to imagine that fits into some of these food justice questions that you brought up a little bit earlier.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I unfortunately haven't had a chance yet to work with our green teens, but we were just having a discussion last night where one of the participants was like, I wish like I had learned about like food access and food justice sooner, because I didn't realize that I was food insecure or was lacking food access. Um, and that's defined differently for different communities. So like, especially in Grand Crossing, it's it's a layer that I'm a white person talking about food access and food insecurity in a community that might not feel like they are food insecure, um, and may not identify that way. So there's layers of talking about it um, in ways that are empowering. And especially when you're at the farm and the kids are actively growing their own food, I feel like that's the connection that is really important. And that gives them that control of, this is my food system. I'm growing this food. And that's really, really an important connection to have, especially when you're in a community that maybe doesn't have grocery stores that you can go to. I know I was doing pre-pandemic, I was working at a nonprofit, and into the pandemic a little bit, that was attempting to address a lot of these like food insecurity issues. And we were working with By the Hand Club in Austin, and Austin is one of the biggest neighborhoods in Chicago, and they're the most food insecure. And after the uprisings in June and May, their only supermarket in the entire community shut down, and it was at a Walmart. And so these kids in the community came together and they had a big peace circle, and they decided like, we're gonna take control of our food system. And so they set up Austin Harvest and worked with locally sourced food in the community to kind of provide just like a pop-up market in this like abandoned storefront in their community. And I think that's where there's not necessarily a gap of knowledge, because we just have different knowledges and different experiences. But that's where the farm is like an opportunity to kind of spark that passion and drive for kids to get involved in their food system.
There's a great question in the chat I want to get to. Sydney, what do you think is the biggest change that we could make in the sort of policy making arena to expand sustainable agriculture and make produce more affordable?
Totally. I think it depends on what realm of government you're trying to address. Federally, there's so many subsidies and lobbyists, and the food industry, like big corporations, have gotten so big that a lot of food activists have become frustrated, and they're like, we've been doing this for 50, 60, 70 years and not making any headway because there's so much money being funneled into politics at the federal level. And that's kind of how GFPP started, was a bunch of researchers and activists and community leaders came together and said, okay, this isn't working. Like, we're not going to beat Monsanto by lobbying Congress right now. We need to focus on local policy. And so I think that's where GFPP is trying to get, like, okay, these are the big buyers in this small area. How can we make them make a change so then we can have a ripple effect and create an alternative. We talk about this a lot, where we're trying to like fix the food system, but also like dismantle it and build a new one. And I think that's where like local politics, like, I mean, it starts at your alderman, it starts at your mayor, and then gets bigger from there. So I think it's important to like really acknowledge the spheres of influence we have if we start small. And I think in terms of that, like in the middle of the pandemic, the city of Chicago decided to make fire hydrants inaccessible. So they put a new key on fire hydrants so that urban farmers couldn't access the water, because a lot of urban farms in the city depend on fire hydrant access to water their crops. And it's those kinds of things where even our local government is so disconnected from how that impacts food. In the middle of a pandemic, you've got all these urban farms relying on this water source, and now you're shutting it off and making it cost, I think it was like upwards of $2,000 to get the key and get the certification to like have the key to the fire hydrant. In the middle of a pandemic, for these small local urban farms, $2,000 is undoable. So that's kind of those local based lack of knowledge in urban policy, lack of connection, that I think is really important to draw attention to policymakers. And Advocates for Urban Agriculture is doing like an incredible job with that. And they have worked extensively with the city over the past year to kind of undo that, that hydrant ordinance that popped up. But yeah.
Sydney, I was excited to hear you talk about wanting to fix the existing system without sort of losing sight of what it might be to build a new system. It makes me think about like other conversations we're having as a nation around criminal justice. Like there's tweaks or there's, you know, changes, but there's also like a reimagining something that just works better for all people. For food systems, what would that look like? I mean, I know it's a big question, but yeah, what might be a better reimagining of how we could grow and produce and circulate food?
Yeah, I think that it's going to look different for everyone, but I think it's based in that connection. Last night we were having a discussion and someone said, like, on the day-to-day, most people don't have any connection to where their food is from. They can't feed themselves if they needed to. And that's what she thought was the biggest problem in our food system. And I think that's part of it, is we have become so removed from the processes of like nutrients. And I mean, talk about pandemic, like the food you're growing is what boosts your immune system and like things like that. And so I think part of it is that food sovereignty aspect, that complete control and the ability to like make a living growing food, and growing food for your neighbors, growing food for your community, is a huge, huge part of it that we've become really disconnected from. I think workers' rights is also huge, and I think that plays into it as well, especially in large scale. I mean, the beautiful thing about local farms, and maybe a reason why some of the food is more expensive, is because they tend to pay their workers living wages. And you look at Tyson and Monsanto and all of these big name corporations abusing their workers, and especially immigrant workers who they actively deport and work with local like ICE organizations to deport their farm workers and then hire new ones because they know immigrants are always going to be coming in. And it's stuff like that. I think that makes a food system positive or detrimental. And I think it's an acknowledgement of how our food system started in the United States. And a lot of that is interconnected with slavery and land stealing. And so reimagining a food system requires us to look at these issues of race and of economic equity and of social justice, and like deeply acknowledge how that's rooted in our food. Because otherwise we're just allowing the system to continue.
Sydney, I'd be interested in knowing a little bit more about the Good Food Purchasing Policy initiative that you brought up very early on. It sounds to me like one aspect of that work is the creation of a data structure that allows institutions to sort of have easier access to responsible choices. What are some of the other aspects of that initiative? I'd just be curious to know more, in part because there's a cynical part of me that's kind of like, okay, sure, you're giving them better options, but how do we know if they're actually taking those options? Who's keeping an eye on who's keeping people accountable? So I'd just be curious to know more.
Yeah, so that is exactly why CIFPAC started. Chicago Food Policy Action Council was to hold these institutions accountable, because you just get that certification and you don't actually do the work, but it's kind of tiered. So you have opportunity to grow in your institution of what kind of level of GFPP you're actually participating in. And there's a lot of people doing a lot of work. I don't work necessarily in the realm of accountability, but there's a ton of different layers to the policy that all of the people at CIFPAC are actively working to say, like, are you doing this? You could be doing X instead of Y. So there's a structure there for that. It's definitely like a work in progress. Like CPS isn't entirely local, and there's different, especially like different schools have access to different food. It's really layered, and each institution is different in how they even go about purchasing their food. So unfortunately, it is kind of a model of, we have to meet you where you're at, and take baby steps from there, because it's not going to happen overnight that all of a sudden, like, all of Chartwells are just going to start sourcing. And there's the layer of, like, currently, as is, the local food system couldn't necessarily meet the demand of all of Chartwell's needs. So there's layers there. There's also the layer of, if you're buying locally, you have to eat seasonally. And I think that's hard at the consumer level, and it's hard to convince institutions that if you provide seasonal food, people will eat it. But it's hard to convince an institution that, yeah, you're not going to get strawberries when strawberries are out of season in the Midwest. Like, sorry. And that's a big barrier to, like, complete adoption. Yeah,
I was just thinking about that. The resistance there would be to that, to think that there are certain foods that just wouldn't be available in the Midwest ever, and then others that have a very short season. I think we're coming to the end. So if you haven't had a chance to drop your question in the chat, be sure to do that. I'm curious, Sydney, if you have plans or hopes after your master's program, sort of what might be next for you. And I guess tied to that, for any folks listening who also imagine a career or kind of work in food justice, what advice you have?
Yeah. So post-grad, I graduate in June, so it's coming up. But post-grad, I'm hoping to stay involved with Gary Comer for a little bit longer. But initially just stay in the realm of food justice work, no matter what that looks like. So thankfully, there's tons of ways to be involved with your food system because it impacts literally everything. So I'm not 100% sure if I want to go down like policy route or research route, but currently being at the farm is kind of what is like getting me going every day. I'm in a beekeeping class right now, as I mentioned, and like that is that's my joy every day, is like taking care of bees and learning about how even something like so tiny has such a giant impact on how we sustain ourselves. So we'll see where that leads. Maybe I'll become a beekeeper. Maybe I'll be working in policy work. But it's kind of an exciting time in food in general, because unfortunately the pandemic has like forced so many people to rethink how this is operating, because it's not sustainable. And in a world of climate change, we're going to have pandemics and crises that require us to have a food system that is resilient. And right now we don't. At a national scale, there's local resilience that's really strong, but we need to get more people connected into it. So there's opportunity for a lot of work in this sector, which is exciting. My advice would be to, if you're interested in getting into food, is to try everything. Like it's tricky because a lot of like initial jobs in food are maybe lower paying. So that's a barrier, but I think it's just like about trying something out, getting your feet wet at a community garden even, and seeing what you are passionate about. If you're passionate about the science, if you're passionate about the people, if you're passionate about cooking, like there's so many ways, or education even, there's so many ways to be involved in this fight and this movement. And you just have to find what you're passionate about.
Thank you, Sydney. I think that's a great note to end on. And I think, we've got a lot of folks in the chat also saying, thank you for this conversation. I learned a lot from you in a short amount of time, which is amazing. And yes, for those listening in, I'd encourage you to donate to the Gary Comer Education Campus, or to the Urban Growers Collective, two organizations Sydney has mentioned. We'll be adding information and further resources on the webpage for this event. So the same place that you found the registration link, be sure to check back there. We'll also upload the podcast version of this conversation when the time comes. And I hope you will all join us in 2 weeks for our next conversation on the future of small business in Chicago. That's going to be Friday, May 7th, same time, 12:30 p.m. We'll have two of the founders of Rogers Park Provisions and On Delay Market joining us for that conversation. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.